Lavulavu, this is Pacific Waves from RNZ Pacific. I'm Susana Suisuki. Coming up, French President Emmanuel Macron arrives in Noumea. Also,
I don't think I've ever advertised. I don't think advertising is a particularly efficient way to do it.
The appointment of Fiji and Drua's new coach raises concerns among locals, and
highlighting where there are significant inequities amongst different communities or what we call priority populations.
Is New Zealand less welcoming towards Pacific people? Well, a new study thinks so. French President Emmanuel Macron has arrived in New Caledonia, which remains under a state of emergency after the worst civil disturbance in nearly 40 years. The riot started on May 13th, just ahead of the French National Assembly in Paris, voting for a constitutional amendment that would significantly modify the rules of eligibility for local elections. Lydia Lewis has more.
French President Emmanuel Macron calls this mission the priority of all priorities.
My wish here with the ministers and the government is to be at the side of the population so that, as quickly as possible, we have the return of peace, calm and security. That's the main priority.
After almost 2 weeks of burning, looting and blockades, this presidential mission aims to be one of peace and dialogue.
It's also obvious another priority is to restore food supplies to a normal level. I know a lot of the population is suffering and some are sick because of the crisis situation.
He's expected to make several announcements. Massey University Associate Professor Anna Pohl says the course of action is limited to one option from a strategic French foreign policy view.
The dominant option would be to return to that freeze and to get all parties back to the dialogue table. But there also needs to be a very clear, genuine engagement on the French part with the government of New Caledonia, with pro-independence groups, in order for there to be a rebuilding of trust.
Mr Macron has said all stakeholders need to participate in discussions, and he added that appeasement could not be a step backwards. There are high expectations, though, within the New Caledonia community. Local journalist Coralie Corchon has been spending time with rioters who want the proposed voting law scrapped. But she says what families of young Canucks caught up in violence want most are answers.
We can see on some videos people that are shot, but we don't know what happened after that. For them, that's the problem, because some of Kanak protesters, they disappeared, a lot of young people, and the families are very afraid and also wondering what happened, and they want answers from the president and from France.
Mr Macron plans to install a dialogue mission tasked to restore communication links with local politicians. The mission will stay in New Caledonia as long as it takes, and its goal will be to have a local political dialogue with the view of arriving at a comprehensive political agreement regarding New Caledonia's long-term future.
The revelation that the Fijian Drua head coach position was not advertised has raised concerns within the rugby fraternity in Fiji. While Drua Chief Executive Officer Mark Evans says he doesn't believe in advertising the role, the Secretary of the Suva Rugby Union claims there is an intentional bias against locals who can do the job. Elisa Tora has the story.
The Fijian Drua announced the appointment of Glenn Jackson as the new Drua coach from 2025 earlier this week. But questions have been asked why there was no local coach considered for the position and whether the post was advertised. Evans says he has never advertised such positions.
I don't think I've ever advertised. I don't think advertising is a particularly efficient way to do it.
He says Jackson's selection was recommended by former All Blacks coach Sir Graham Henry and supported by the independent Drua board.
He emerged as the preferred candidate and was offered the post, which he has, I'm glad to say, accepted.
Evans says Jackson will ensure continuity moving forward.
Glenn's been with us since the beginning of the Drua project in Super Rugby. To be honest, we were also looking for some continuity amongst the coaching panel.
Current Drua head coach Mick Byrne, who will take up the Flying Fijians coaching job next month, says Jackson was the right man for the role.
He'll do a great job, and also the relationship now for the Flying Fijians and Drua will be nice and close.
But Super Rugby Union Secretary Nemani Tuifangalele does not agree and says the country has become a breeding ground for expat coaches. Tuifangalele says what the FRU and Drua have done is shameful as they kept on dumping locals in the trash bin. Former Drua coach Senirusi Servakula and former Flying Fijians coach Inoke Male are two of the highest-ranked local coaches in Fiji, while Servakula was also the first Fijian coach for the Drua when they initially played in the Australian Domestic National Rugby Championships from 2017 to 2019.
A former Tongan cabinet minister who is appealing his conviction for fraudulently obtaining government funds is back in hot water. Etuate Lavulavu, with his wife Akosita, ran an educational institute where, to get more state funding, they greatly inflated the number of students enrolled. After both had their convictions quashed on appeal, they were retired and convicted in the Supreme Court, and those convictions are now under appeal. In the meantime, Etuate Lavulavu has found himself convicted of contempt for comments about a trial judge. Don Wiseman spoke with RNZ Pacific's Tonga correspondent, Galafi Moala, about the latest developments in the never-ending Lavulavu saga.
He has been issued with contempt of court and found guilty of that. Has also been fined $15,000 and ordered that he could not in any way whatsoever say anything publicly or a recording or whatever concerning the judge or the judiciary.
What specifically did he say about the judge?
Well, he was basically raising a lot of questions concerning the judge. Remember, right from the beginning when the Lavulavus were charged and convicted for fraud, he continued, he blamed the people that goes in there and get your statistics concerning finances and so on. And he blamed them for that they did wrong. They violated, they went into his office and basically opened his office and got his records without his permission. So all the way through, whatever charges he got, he's always had an excuse to come up with. And then when he was convicted in the recent case, the big question she raised was that the judge was partial. He apparently saw two top government officials talking the judge, so he took that as a signal that the judge was being biased against him. He then went on programs, live programs with a guy from New Zealand, and they started having these programs in which he continued to attack and raise questions on the judge and his partiality and so on. And finally got into Tonga, and that's where the acting Chief Justice acted, and he was called into court and charged with contempt of court.
They were convicted, and then that was appealed, and they were successful, and then the case was reheard in the Supreme Court, and they were convicted. Now, they are appealing. What grounds are they appealing now?
Well, it's nothing to do with contempt. What I mean by that is the merit of the charges. It always has to do with some kind of process. There was a violation of process. Something happened. So definitely they're going to be heard again. The Lavulavus don't realize that as long as they keep doing this, their reputation is completely in tatters. You've got to remember the primary goal and occupation of these two people, both the husband and the wife, is political. There is an election coming up next year, 2025, in Tonga. They both think that there is a possibility that if they could clear their names, they could run again. But it would be really foolish Tongans to ever elect it. It's not so much that there's all of these contempt of court cases and so on. The basic thing was that these two people who were ministers before in cabinet, and they used their power and opportunity because they had a school to do fraudulent things to get money from the government. And that's the basic fundamental charge.
There's never been any apology from them for the use of public money or the misuse.
public money.
No, never been any apology. On the other hand, they have gone out on the attack for people that were part of their school who testified, yes, the names were included. They were not students, but they were included. It's the list of students so that they could get compensation for. That's the Lavulavus. They go on the counter-attack of people that have witness against them and so on. Never been an apology. Feel they're still in the right. It's a huge thing. There are two perfect examples of how corruption is dealt with in the Kingdom of Tonga, and it's been 3-4 years.
Yes, you would have to say that the government and the judicial sector's dealing with it pretty well.
That's correct, yes.
So the Lavulavus, have they actually spent any prison time yet or not?
Oh, yes, they did. They spent prison time before they did that appeal, and then they were, it was successful, and they were released. So the prison time they spent, you're looking, 3 to 4 months, I think it was. It was very much a publicized event, seeing them driven to prison and with their suitcases and so on, and Mrs. Lavulavu was taken to the women's section of the prison, and Mr. Lavulavu. It was just a horrible situation to watch.
Now, their home, I understand that's been moved or deconstructed. What's happened?
Because they were government workers and high government workers at that, they were both ministers of the crown. They were allowed to rent a government housing. Pretty good government housing right on the waterfront overlooking the beach. So finally the government said, you are no longer working for the government. You've got all these problems and move out. We're going to take that back. And so they just did that, I think, about a week ago. They were moved out of their house and the government have taken over that house.
A new report released by the Mental Health and Wellbeing Commission says New Zealand is becoming less welcoming to Pacific people. The report found from 2018 to 2021 there was a 71% increase in the likelihood that Pacific peoples would experience racist discrimination, and Pacific people are finding it harder to be themselves. Caleb Fotheringham spoke to the report's lead author, Dr. Ellen Cullen.
It paints a picture of the status of mental health and wellbeing experienced by Pacific peoples in Aotearoa. It brings together insights from kind of our assessment and monitoring of Pacific people's wellbeing, and we also engage some Pacific communities and organisations about what they think Pacific people need in order to thrive.
The report says there has been a 71% increase in the likelihood that Pacific peoples experience racist discrimination. Why do you think this has gone up?
So what the report says, it measures wellbeing and mental health on several indicators. There was a general increase in discrimination that went up, but specifically for Pacific, it went up for racist discrimination. The report does talk about Pacific peoples finding Aotearoa less welcoming and less understanding. So there are other sort of findings that could be, you could read into as well in terms of finding it harder to be themselves in Aotearoa. There's also another finding around Pacific young people feeling like they belong less to their schools as well. So there's some general there's several indicators in terms of how welcoming Pacific people are generally finding Aotearoa.
Are Pacific people worse off in all these metrics compared to non-Pacific people?
So they're sort of lower in terms of well-being, but there is one finding where Pacific peoples report higher family well-being. So in comparison to non-Pacific people, we heard that, despite all of these challenges and all of the kind of negative findings, I suppose, Pacific people are still finding families as a source of well-being. So they're rating the well-being of their families higher than non-Pacific people.
Are there any solutions to these metrics?
There's a number of solutions. We spoke to Pacific NGOs and sort of leaders of Pacific in the Pacific communities about some of these findings. The report does go into some clear examples at the moment in communities about what's working for Pacific families, but we do want to see a continued focus on mental health and wellbeing outcomes for Pacific people. So that will require increased effort across government agencies. So there's a need for ongoing leadership from the Ministry of Pacific Peoples and Pacific leaders. The other thing that the report talks about is holistic on-the-ground support. So that really makes the difference for Pacific families. So we do need to make it easier for people, or Pacific people, to access a range of services from organisations that are embedded in their culture. And another key finding that we heard from our interviews in the report was that one of the major constraints for delivering these effective mental health services and supporting wellbeing for Pacific families is how Pacific organisations are actually funded. So we heard that introducing contracting models built on trust will ensure Pacific organisations can meet the needs of their Pacific communities.
Is this trend of Pacific people's wellbeing being not so great and getting worse, is this a general trend happening to everybody?
I mean, not to the same extent. So I think that's the role that we play in terms of, highlighting where there are significant inequities amongst different communities or what we call priority populations. And so there is a need here, especially for Pacific peoples, for effort and investment in these outcomes and better mental health and wellbeing outcomes.
That's Pacific Waves for today. To listen back, head over to rnz.co.nz/Pacific. We're also on Spotify, Apple and iHeartRadio. From myself and the RNZ Pacific team, tō whāsui fua.